Alright guys, so in this video I played Far Cry 4 in 2023 for the first time, and like always I'll be giving an overall review and giving my thoughts on the game to see if it still holds up almost 9 years later, to let anyone that wants to play it or revisit it know if it's worth their time. So if you do go on to enjoy this video or find it helpful, then hit that like button down below to let me know, and if you enjoy story video games, then maybe considering subscribing to the channel as well. I put out reviews on various video games, new and old, with of course the Far Cry series mainly at the moment, as I play through each game for the first time, with 5 up next. But for now, let's check out the 4th installment, Far Cry 4. Now, one of the biggest aspects of this game is that it's ran on the same engine and is pretty much the same base game as Far Cry 3, but with a whole new storyline and set of characters, which I didn't really mind, although they can be seen as similar. Far Cry 3 was amazing, so I wasn't really complaining. Now to start off, Far Cry 4's world is set in the Himalayas, and I must say that I think I prefer this setting and theme to any of the previous games. Not only because it's such a unique and different setting to what we've been used to, with of course the Rook Islands, which are so tropical, and then in Africa with Far Cry 2, that's filled with deserts and various jungles. It was so interesting and such a switch in style to play this game with colossal mountains in the backdrop, in the majority of the game everywhere you look, and deep and endless forests. I don't know about you, but if you played the previous games, it felt nice to have a huge change in scenery. But not just that, also how vast the world is and the map. It makes sense with how much, mountain range there is in the game, and just the detail put into the nature and foragery. On top of that, the lighting is just beautiful, which you really notice even in the intense fights, with sun beaming off your weapon or on the ground, which felt a lot more prominent in Far Cry 4, making the gameplay feel much more immersive and enjoyable no matter what you're doing. What I also loved was just the overall colour, not necessarily in the world itself, but just the running theme of coloured powders. You do notice them in the game, in the UI or the main menu. You will have these coloured powders in the background which is run throughout the game. Even down to the fire or the smoke, which I noticed just keeps on improving each time in terms of realism and the animation in each game, and Far Cry 4 makes details like these, which you're bound to always notice when fighting in the many raids and outposts in the game, just feel so alive. There's a huge amount of outposts that keep you fairly engaged throughout the game as you raid each one, which I would say if we're talking about the outpost raids alone, then it doesn't become repetitive for me at least, as it can be a slight challenge to be honest. There's a lot of weapons and gameplay features to always keep implementing, which I'll get into, but there's also other missions that can be done aside from the main story, which are usually very similar with escorts and defending fights, and those, I must admit, do become repetitive, which is a small letdown, but that of course isn't just the main story, which I'll move on to. So the main storyline and narrative of Far Cry 4 I really enjoyed, and the main protagonist of Calzee, his main opening is to spread his mother's ashes, but funny enough that mission doesn't go so smoothly straight away with the ongoing civil war, and the bus you are on gets stopped and searched and then basically just breaks out into guns blazing. But RJ and the other characters of Darpan luckily survived the fight and are met with Pagan Min, who is the antagonist of Far Cry 4. Who was an amazing character and adds a lot to the game's story, a bit like Vars in the last game, even though for the majority of the time when you interact with him it's rarely face to face, and he basically just speaks to you over the radio most of the time, with the rare scene with him actually there, which is a slight shame as I love his whole character design and his personality. It also just feels more immersive and seems more engaging in this way. So far, Far Cry has some of the best villains I've seen in video games, and Pagan Min is, no exception. He's close to being my favourite, but I'm still not fully sure. So then there's choices that affect the journey of the story throughout the game, which I thought was so well implemented in this game, and definitely became one of the things I loved about it, making it so interactive. There's a lot of different ways to play the story with multiple endings like in Far Cry 3. All of the choices featured are so important and drastically shape the narrative, so I would say the game does have a huge amount of replayability for this reason. You do meet the two main side characters of Sabao and Amita, who to shortly put it are arch rivals of each other. They are both determined and have very different views on what they want, with the game making you decide what plans to go with from each of them, and Sabao goes down the route of being truly willing to, progress his country further and help it by trying to reverse it back to what it was, and more of a traditional route. And then Amita wanting to change her home and take very difficult choices for what she believes will benefit her country in the long run. She's a lot more urgent and intense and wants to truly modernize her country, compared to Sabao, who is a lot more focused on preserving the traditions and culture of his home, and he is also a very religious man. So a very opposite set of characters that have huge conflict with an interesting combination of personalities, really adding to the game's story, alongside of course the villain of Pagan Min. All these sets of characters and multiple choices are basically what makes the narrative so good, which was such a new and interesting vision to see, but also having many different meanings, with some thinking the characters use RJ the whole game, etc. Overall, it's a solid story and I really enjoyed it. Now, in terms of the overall gameplay of Far Cry 4, due to the overall gameplay being quite similar to Far Cry 3, with it just being a lot more polished, and yes, there are new features, not a huge amount, but the ones added do make a big difference, and are quite drastic switches. Although I did enjoy Far Cry 3's gameplay and combat, so I probably wouldn't have minded an awful lot anyway. It's mainly the alteration in combat that's the most significant, with very similar gunfights to the previous games, and what I of course expected. I didn't really think there would be a massive change and overhaul. However, the signature moves and takedowns are my favourite improvements in this game, and what keeps the combat exciting and different to what I'm used to. After the same or very similar takedowns and constant shooting, it could get boring to some players. Therefore, the addition of jumping into and kicking out a driver of a vehicle, or taking an enemy's gun to then use on another enemy, and they're all smooth animations that run really well, which I was glad about. Other examples would be a chain takedown, which never gets old really and kinda reminds me of Assassin's Creed a little bit, always being so satisfying of course, and similar to when you steal an enemy's gun, you can also set their grenade off and proceed to kick that enemy into another and of course blow it up. Now, some of these make the stealth side a lot more immersive compared to the previous games where, like in 1 and 2, it was rarely there, and 3 you could actually silently take down people, and they did, promote stealth a bit more, and it does seem like they keep adding to it with each release. But then for some reason it kinda slows down, and the detection in Far Cry 4 has backtracked slightly, with the enemies spotting you the same as sort of Far Cry 2 so quickly. Therefore these takedowns can't always be used stealthily, or at least not as easy, which is a shame, but of course can always be experimented with in all guns and melee fights. You can also move bodies and hide them so other enemies don't spot them, which was a simple feature, although nothing crazy, and it could have been polished a bit more in terms of how smooth the animation is. When you pick them up, the body is just dead still in front of your screen, with no movement involved as seen in the gameplay. Now, the guns blazing side is of course what's seen more in the majority of the gameplay in all the Far Cry games, and additions to fights in terms of weapons and health. You can craft weapon holsters, wallets, loot bags and syringes, a bit like usual, but in Far Cry 4, they actually give you various boosts and perks, which is different and adds a lot more to combat. Some people could say it takes away the realism, and with the usual skill tree system, although in Far Cry 2, it has two different sides of the elephant and the tiger, which is a running theme that's present throughout the whole game, with so many skills to choose from that give you much more of an advantage compared to previous games, and what skills they had before. You can choose from many different takedowns as mentioned, to breathing control underwater, or reduce fall damage, and so many more. To add on to this variation in gameplay, there's many animals you can hunt, compared to Far Cry 3, with birds, wolves, deers, monkeys, etc. and huge elephants to find that are actually mountable if you do unlock the skill, and can be used actually in gunfights, which is super fun. So overall, the best way to describe Far Cry 4's gameplay is fun. Although could be polished, the additions make the combat and hunting more interesting, and you shouldn't get bored, and as well as some alterations to parkour, with much more variety in this game, with the use of grapple guns to climb up the side of walls and rocks, then much bigger jumps from ledges that do involve fluid and a lot more animated movement when you climb up them. And with all that being said, I believe this is where I wrap up my overall review of Far Cry 4. I definitely do recommend this game, especially if you've played 3, which I'm sure most people have. Although not everyone, and the story and characters are completely different, so you can easily play it with no experience of all the previous games. There's some aspects in Far Cry 3 that are either not as polished or even added in Far Cry 4, which is slightly disappointing, but overall it may be similar to the last game in many ways. Although it doesn't really matter anyway, as I and many others did enjoy the last game, and of course there's various features added to gameplay with a unique story and narrative that wasn't expected. Now Far Cry 5 is up next, where I've heard the good, the bad and the ugly, so that'll be interesting in the next video, and I'll see if it still holds up now. I really hope you enjoyed this video or found it helpful, and now you have decided if you want to play this game or revisit it after a while. Let me know by hitting that like button down below, and maybe even considering subscribing to the channel as well. As I said, if you enjoy story video games, I have an array of reviews and talks on the channel around various ones. A playlist should be in the description down below for another series that I've done, and the Far Cry series is of course at the moment, as I'm playing through all of them for the first time, so my Far Cry 3 review is on the screen right now. Thank you so much for watching until the end, and bye bye.